On a cold February morning in 1943, the sound of 4 roaring engines echoed across an American airfield somewhere in North Africa. One after another, massive silver bombers rolled toward the runway, their propellers throwing clouds of dust into the crisp morning air. Ground crews waved the aircraft forward, while mechanics performed their final inspections, checking fuel lines, engines, landing gear, and hundreds of other details that could determine whether an airplane and its crew would return home alive. For the men climbing aboard those bombers, this was becoming routine. At least, that was what they told themselves. Every mission carried the possibility that it would be their last. Unlike fighter pilots, who usually flew alone or with a wingman, the crews of American heavy bombers depended entirely on one another. Inside each aircraft, 10 men worked as a single machine. The pilot and co-pilot guided the bomber through enemy skies. The navigator calculated courses over hundreds of miles of hostile territory. The bombardier prepared the payload that factories and workers back home had spent weeks building. Radio operators maintained contact with Allied forces while waist gunners, nose gunners, ball turret gunners, and tail gunners scanned the skies for enemy fighters. Each position mattered. If one man failed, everyone could die. Among the dozens of aircraft preparing for departure that morning was one particular bomber that looked almost identical to all the others. Its official designation was simple: a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Its nickname, All-American. No one standing on the airfield that morning could have imagined that this aircraft would soon become one of the most famous bombers of the Second World War. Nor could they have guessed that photographs of its shattered fuselage would eventually be studied by military engineers, aviation historians, and pilots for generations to come. Because what was about to happen to All-American seemed completely impossible. To understand why, one first has to understand the airplane itself. When Boeing introduced the B-17 during the 1930s, many military observers believed it looked almost invincible. It was enormous. With a wingspan of more than 100 feet, the bomber dwarfed many aircraft of its era. 4 powerful Wright Cyclone radial engines allowed it to cruise for thousands of miles while carrying heavy bomb loads deep into enemy territory. Thick aluminum construction protected the crew better than most earlier bombers, while multiple defensive machine guns covered nearly every direction from which enemy fighters might attack. Reporters eventually gave it a nickname that perfectly captured its reputation: the Flying Fortress. It wasn't simply marketing. The aircraft earned that name through countless combat missions. Stories spread rapidly among American airmen about B-17s returning to England with engines destroyed, wings riddled with holes, and control surfaces nearly torn away. Some bombers landed despite losing entire sections of their tails. Others returned after sustaining hundreds of bullet holes. Again and again, the Flying Fortress refused to fall. The crews trusted it, sometimes more than they trusted luck itself. Still, even the strongest airplane had limits. The men of the 97th Bomb Group understood those limits better than anyone, operating from North Africa after the Allied invasion known as Operation Torch. They flew long-range bombing missions across the Mediterranean against German and Italian targets. Every flight meant crossing hundreds of miles of open water before entering heavily defended airspace, where anti-aircraft artillery and enemy fighters waited. The Luftwaffe had learned quickly that destroying American bombers required aggression. German fighter pilots rarely attacked from behind. The B-17's tail gunner made that approach far too dangerous. Instead, experienced Luftwaffe pilots preferred high-speed frontal attacks, diving passes, or coordinated strikes from multiple directions designed to overwhelm the bomber's defensive guns. The air battles often lasted only minutes. Yet those minutes became some of the most terrifying experiences imaginable. Imagine standing inside an aluminum tube flying nearly 20,000 feet above the Earth. Outside, the temperature measured far below freezing. Oxygen became so scarce that every crew member depended upon masks connected to the aircraft's oxygen system. Wind screamed through tiny openings around gun positions. Then suddenly, enemy fighters appeared. At first they looked harmless. Tiny black dots. Moments later, they transformed into fast-moving aircraft firing streams of cannon shells and machine gun bullets capable of tearing through aluminum like paper. The bomber shook violently. Windows shattered. Warning lights illuminated the cockpit. Men shouted over the intercom while defensive gunners desperately searched for targets moving hundreds of miles per hour. The sky itself became a battlefield. That was simply another day inside a B-17. The crew of All-American had already experienced enough combat to understand these dangers intimately. They trusted one another completely. The pilot knew his co-pilot would monitor every engine instrument while maneuvering through enemy fire. The navigator knew the radio operator would maintain communications under impossible circumstances. The waist gunners understood that every second spent watching their assigned sectors could determine whether everyone survived. Combat created bonds difficult to explain. Each mission depended less upon individual courage than collective discipline. Everyone had a job. Everyone trusted everyone else. On February 1, 1943, All-American joined dozens of other B-17s, assigned to attack Axis-controlled targets in Tunisia. The campaign in North Africa had entered a critical stage. Allied forces sought to cripple German supply lines, supporting Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's remaining forces. Every successful bombing mission meant fewer trucks, fewer supplies, and fewer reinforcements reaching the front. Failure carried enormous consequences. The bombers climbed steadily after takeoff, gradually forming the tight combat boxes that became one of the defining tactics of American strategic bombing. Flying close together wasn't merely for appearance. It created overlapping fields of defensive fire. Enemy fighters attacking one bomber immediately exposed themselves to machine guns from several others. At least, that was the theory. Reality often proved far more chaotic. Hours later, after crossing the Mediterranean, the formation approached enemy territory. The first signs of danger appeared almost immediately. Dark puffs of smoke erupted around the bombers as German anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. Black bursts surrounded the formation. Each explosion filled the sky with razor-sharp steel fragments. The crews continued forward. Flak, terrifying as it was, followed predictable mathematics. Enemy fighters did not. Minutes later, lookouts spotted them. Messerschmitt Bf 109Is. Fast. Heavily armed. Closing rapidly. The warning spread through every aircraft. Fighters. Almost instantly, machine gunners swung their weapons toward the approaching enemy. Pilots tightened formation. The bombardiers remained focused on the target ahead. Then the first German fighters attacked. Some dived from above. Others climbed beneath the bombers before opening fire. Machine guns thundered across the sky. Bright tracer rounds crossed in every direction. The peaceful morning disappeared beneath chaos. Inside All-American, every crew member concentrated completely on survival. No one realized that one German fighter pilot had already committed himself to an attack unlike anything they had ever experienced. His aircraft kept coming. Closer. Closer still, far closer than normal attack doctrine recommended. At first, the Americans assumed he intended another firing pass. Then something became horribly obvious. The German fighter wasn't pulling away. It continued racing directly toward the B-17. The closing speed became unbelievable. Hundreds of miles per hour. Neither aircraft changed course. For one terrifying instant, it seemed impossible that both pilots intended to occupy the same piece of sky. Then, the impossible happened. The Messerschmitt slammed directly into the rear of All-American. The impact shook the flying fortress so violently that several crew members believed the bomber had exploded. Metal screamed. Glass shattered. The entire aircraft lurched sideways. Inside the cockpit, warning lights illuminated almost every instrument panel simultaneously. No one knew exactly what remained attached to the airplane. No one knew whether they were already falling. Only one thing became immediately clear. The flying fortress had just suffered damage that no bomber was ever designed to survive. And somehow, it was still flying. For a split second after the collision, no one inside All-American understood what had happened. The impact was unlike anything the crew had ever experienced. It wasn't the violent shaking caused by anti-aircraft shells, nor the sudden jolt of a fighter's cannon rounds striking the fuselage. This was something far more terrifying. The entire bomber seemed to twist in midair, as if an invisible giant had grabbed it by the tail and tried to tear it apart. The deafening roar of the engines was suddenly drowned out by the horrible sound of ripping metal. Steel cables snapped like gunshots. Sheets of aluminum peeled backward into the freezing air. Windows exploded inward. Loose equipment flew through the cabin. Several crewmen were thrown violently against the walls of the aircraft, while others instinctively grabbed whatever they could reach to keep from being hurled across the fuselage. For one horrifying moment, everyone aboard believed the airplane had broken apart. The German fighter had not merely struck the bomber. It had practically cut into it. Flying at tremendous speed, the Messerschmitt smashed into the left side of All-American's tail section before disintegrating into thousands of pieces. The fighter itself vanished almost instantly, its wreckage spiraling toward the ground below. Parts of its engine, wings, and fuselage ripped through the B-17 as though fired from enormous cannons. The force of the collision destroyed almost everything in its path. The left horizontal stabilizer was completely torn away. Much of the vertical tail fin disappeared. The rudder was shredded. Control cables snapped. Large sections of the rear fuselage simply ceased to exist. One of the waist gunners later recalled looking toward the back of the airplane and seeing something that should have been impossible. There was daylight where the tail should have been. The rear of the aircraft appeared almost detached from the rest of the bomber. Only a handful of twisted aluminum beams, damaged skin panels, and a few surviving structural members still connected the tail assembly to the main fuselage. It looked less like an airplane, and more like a broken toy somehow refusing to come apart. The crew waited for the inevitable. Every pilot understood what happened when an aircraft lost its tail. Without it, maintaining stability became almost impossible. The elevators controlled pitch. The rudder controlled yaw. Remove those surfaces, and the airplane normally entered an uncontrollable dive before breaking apart under the enormous aerodynamic forces acting upon it. That should have happened. Instead, All-American kept flying. Inside the cockpit, the pilot gripped the control yoke with both hands, immediately realizing something was terribly wrong. The aircraft responded sluggishly, almost reluctantly, to every control input. It wanted to roll. It wanted to yaw. It constantly tried to drift off course. Keeping it level demanded every ounce of concentration. The co-pilot quickly scanned the instruments. Engine temperatures, oil pressure, hydraulic systems, fuel, electrical circuits. Miraculously, the engines still worked. The wings remained attached. The aircraft still possessed enough lift to stay airborne. But there was another problem. No one knew whether the damaged tail would remain attached for another 5 minutes, or another 5 seconds. Behind the cockpit, the rest of the crew struggled to understand the full extent of the disaster. The radio operator attempted contacting nearby bombers. His first transmission barely made sense. We've been hit." There was a long pause. Then he added words almost impossible to believe. "Our tail is gone." Nearby American crews looked toward All-American. Many couldn't believe what they were seeing. The bomber looked mortally wounded. The rear section sagged noticeably below its normal position. Torn aluminum fluttered violently in the slipstream, while the remaining fragments of the tail shook with every movement of the airplane. One crewman aboard another B-17 later admitted he expected the bomber to explode at any moment. It somehow refused. As the formation continued toward the target, the pilot faced an impossible decision: continue the mission, or turn back immediately. Ordinarily, heavily damaged bombers left the formation and headed home under escort if possible. but separating carried enormous risks. A lone B-17 became an easy target for German fighters. Staying with the formation offered better protection, yet the damaged tail might not survive another sharp maneuver. The decision was made almost automatically. They would try to stay with the group for as long as the airplane remained controllable. Then another problem emerged. Enemy fighters noticed them. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots constantly searched bomber formations for aircraft that appeared damaged or isolated. Such bombers became priority targets because they required less ammunition to destroy. From a distance, all American looked finished. Several German pilots altered course toward the crippled flying fortress. Inside the waist gun positions, the remaining gunners prepared for another attack despite barely believing the airplane could survive one more hit. Every man understood the terrifying reality. The bomber no longer possessed the structural strength it once had. Another collision. Another cannon burst. Another major impact. Any one of them could finally tear the tail completely away. The fighters closed rapidly. Machine guns opened fire. Bright tracer rounds streaked through the sky. The American gunners answered immediately. Despite the severe damage, the flying fortress still fought back. Bullets crossed between the aircraft as both sides desperately searched for an advantage. Several German fighters approached cautiously. Even crippled, a B-17 remained heavily armed. A careless attack could easily become fatal. One Messerschmitt made a firing pass from above, sending cannon shells crashing into the bomber's already damaged fuselage. The airplane shuddered again. Everyone instinctively glanced toward the tail. Still attached. Barely. Another fighter attacked from the side. Again, the bomber absorbed additional damage. Again, it remained airborne. The Germans seemed almost as surprised as the Americans. The aircraft simply refused to die. Eventually, the Luftwaffe pilots broke away, either low on ammunition or unwilling to risk prolonged attacks against a bomber still capable of defending itself. For the first time since the collision, the crew could concentrate entirely on getting home. That proved easier said than done. Every mile placed new stress upon the damaged structure. Air flowing over the shattered tail caused violent vibrations throughout the aircraft. Crew members could actually watch sections of aluminum flexing back and forth in ways no airplane should ever flex. Each gust of wind threatened catastrophe. The pilot avoided abrupt movements. No sharp turns. No sudden climbs. No rapid descents. Every control input became slow, deliberate, almost gentle. He treated the bomber less like a combat aircraft, and more like an injured animal barely capable of standing. Meanwhile, several crew members crawled carefully toward the rear of the airplane to inspect the damage more closely. The sight left them speechless. The tail section looked ready to separate completely. Entire structural members had been bent or ripped apart. Rivets had disappeared by the hundreds. Jagged holes exposed the empty sky below. Pieces of control cables hung uselessly through the fuselage. One man quietly admitted later that he could actually see the ground through openings where solid aluminum had existed only minutes before. Even worse, some of the remaining support beams showed fresh cracks. Nobody dared touch anything. They feared even additional weight might finish what the collision had started. The bomber continued its long journey across the Mediterranean. Hours passed. Every minute felt like another miracle. The crew spoke very little. There wasn't much left to say. Either the airplane would hold together, or it wouldn't. As they finally approached friendly territory, another challenge appeared: landing. Keeping the aircraft airborne had been difficult enough. Landing it safely might prove impossible. Every pilot knew that landing placed enormous stress upon an airplane structure. Lowering the landing gear altered airflow. Extending flaps changed lift characteristics. Reducing speed affected stability. Most critically, touching down on the runway generated powerful forces that traveled through the entire airframe. If the tail survived combat, would it survive the landing? No one aboard knew the answer. Waiting far below, however, Hundreds of mechanics and ground personnel were about to witness one of the most unbelievable sights of the entire Second World War. As the North African coastline slowly emerged on the horizon, no one aboard All American felt relieved. Surviving enemy fighters was only half the battle. Now came the part every experienced pilot feared: getting the bomber back onto the ground. From a distance, the airfield looked peaceful. Tiny vehicles moved between hangars while mechanics prepared for the return of the day's bombing mission. Ambulances stood ready near the runway, as they did after every major operation. Medical teams expected wounded airmen. Fire crews prepared for emergency landings. Everyone understood that not every bomber would return in perfect condition. Still, nothing prepared them for what they were about to witness. The control tower received a radio message from the damaged B-17 requesting priority clearance to land. The transmission sounded calm, professional. The pilot carefully explained that his aircraft had suffered severe structural damage following a collision with a German fighter. At first, the controllers assumed he meant ordinary battle damage, perhaps a damaged engine, maybe a fuel leak, a few holes in the wings. Then someone inside the tower raised binoculars toward the approaching aircraft. Silence filled the room. The controller lowered the binoculars for a moment, almost convinced his eyes had deceived him. He looked again. The bomber's tail was missing. Not completely, but almost. The rear section appeared to hang from the rest of the airplane by little more than twisted sheets of aluminum. Large sections of the vertical stabilizer had disappeared entirely. The left horizontal stabilizer was gone. Huge pieces of the fuselage had been ripped open, exposing the aircraft's internal structure to the rushing wind. It didn't look capable of flying. Yet somehow, it continued approaching the runway. Word spread across the airfield almost instantly. Mechanics abandoned maintenance work. Pilots stopped preparing other aircraft. Ground crews pointed toward the sky in disbelief. Within minutes, dozens of men lined the edges of the runway, watching one of the most extraordinary sights they would ever witness during the war. The closer All American came, the more unbelievable the damage appeared. Some observers later admitted they expected the tail to separate before the bomber even reached the airfield. Others believed the landing gear would collapse the instant the aircraft touched the ground. A few quietly wondered whether the pilot should even attempt landing at all. There was no alternative. The airplane no longer possessed enough fuel to remain airborne much longer. Inside the cockpit, the pilot ignored everything except the controls. He had flown damaged aircraft before. Nothing remotely comparable to this. Every movement demanded extraordinary precision. Normally, pilots lowered landing flaps gradually while reducing airspeed to prepare for touchdown. This time, nothing was normal. Reducing speed too quickly could rob the damaged tail of the airflow, helping keep it aligned. Turning too sharply could twist the weakened fuselage until it finally snapped. Even lowering the landing gear risked changing the aircraft's balance enough to create uncontrollable instability. Every action required careful thought. The co-pilot quietly called out airspeed, altitude, distance remaining. Neither man raised his voice. Panic served no purpose now. Behind them, the rest of the crew waited in tense silence. Most had already accepted the possibility that they might survive enemy fighters only to die a few hundred yards from safety. No one complained. No one prayed out loud. There was simply nothing left to do except trust the pilot. And trust the airplane. As All American descended toward the runway, the pilot reached for the landing gear controls. There was a brief pause. He glanced once more at the engine instruments. Everything remained surprisingly stable. He lowered the lever. The landing gear extended. The bomber immediately shuddered. Every crew member felt it. The change in airflow sent fresh vibrations racing through the damaged airframe. Somewhere behind them, torn aluminum groaned under enormous stress. Several crewmen instinctively looked toward the rear of the aircraft. The tail still remained attached. Barely. Outside, mechanics watching through binoculars saw sections of metal flexing alarmingly. One later described it as watching a bridge sway during a hurricane. The structure seemed alive. Yet it somehow continued holding together. Now came the hardest part. The final approach. The pilot carefully lined the bomber up with the runway, making only the smallest corrections possible. Any abrupt movement risked disaster. The aircraft drifted slightly. He corrected gently. Too much rudder might tear away what remained of the tail. Too much elevator input could overload the weakened fuselage. Every instinct developed through years of flying had to be balanced against the reality that this was no longer an ordinary airplane. The runway rushed closer. 500 feet. 300. 100. The wheels hovered just above the ground. Then, the main landing gear touched. The impact echoed through the aircraft. Every eye turned instinctively toward the rear. Nothing happened. The tail remained attached. The bomber bounced once before settling back onto the runway. The pilot carefully reduced power. No sudden braking. No violent steering. The aircraft rolled forward, gradually slowing beneath its own momentum. Finally, after thousands of miles through hostile skies, after anti-aircraft fire, after Luftwaffe fighters, after a mid-air collision that should have destroyed any aircraft, All-American came to a complete stop. For several seconds, nobody moved. Ground crews simply stared. Then cheering erupted across the airfield. Mechanics, medics, officers, and pilots sprinted toward the bomber from every direction. The crew slowly climbed out, many still unable to fully comprehend what had happened. As the last airman stepped onto the runway, engineers immediately surrounded the aircraft. The closer they looked, the more astonishing the situation became. Large portions of the rear fuselage had been completely destroyed. Hundreds of rivets had sheared away. Critical structural members were bent beyond recognition. The left horizontal stabilizer no longer existed. The vertical stabilizer had been almost cut in half. Only a handful of damaged metal spars, a few surviving skin panels, and remnants of internal framing had kept the tail connected to the rest of the airplane. One engineer quietly remarked that if he had seen the aircraft before landing, he would have sworn it couldn't possibly fly. Another reportedly stated that he wouldn't have believed the damage if he hadn't touched it himself. The photographs taken shortly afterward spread rapidly throughout Allied commands. Pilots examined them in disbelief. Aircraft designers studied them carefully. Military leaders saw them as proof of something they had long hoped was true. The Boeing B-17 had earned its nickname. The Flying Fortress wasn't merely tough. It was extraordinary. The remarkable survival of All-American also provided invaluable information to aviation engineers. By studying the bomber's shattered structure, they gained a better understanding of how stress traveled through the B-17's airframe. The accident revealed strengths in the aircraft's design that even Boeing's engineers had never fully appreciated. Redundant structural members, reinforced joints, and the bomber's rugged internal framework had prevented complete failure under circumstances no designer had ever anticipated. Those lessons influenced maintenance procedures, damage assessment, and even future aircraft development. The crew themselves quickly became minor legends within the Army Air Forces. Whenever new bomber crews arrived in North Africa or later in England, veterans often pointed toward the famous photographs. See that airplane? It actually landed. Young airmen usually assumed the story had been exaggerated. Then they saw the pictures. No exaggeration was necessary. The airplane looked as though it had already crashed. Yet it hadn't. The German pilot whose fighter collided with All-American never returned home. Historians still debate whether the collision was accidental, caused by the chaos of aerial combat, or the result of a final desperate maneuver after his aircraft had already been heavily damaged. Whatever the reason, Both aircraft met in a fraction of a second high above Tunisia. Only one continued flying. In the years following the war, thousands of B-17s were scrapped as newer aircraft replaced them. Aluminum from once famous bombers was melted down, recycled, and transformed into entirely different machines. Airfields emptied. Combat groups were disbanded. The skies that had once thundered with hundreds of flying fortresses gradually fell silent. But the story of All-American refused to disappear. It became one of the greatest examples of engineering resilience in aviation history, taught not only in military circles, but also in discussions of aircraft design and structural integrity. More importantly, it became a symbol of the crews who trusted those machines with their lives every single day. Because the true miracle wasn't simply that a damaged bomber returned home. It was that 10 men climbed aboard an airplane every morning, knowing there was a real possibility they would never see another sunrise. They flew anyway, mission after mission, over enemy territory, against flak, fighters, mechanical failures, freezing temperatures, and impossible odds. All-American survived because of remarkable engineering. But it also survived because its crew remained disciplined when panic would have been understandable, because its pilot treated a dying airplane with extraordinary precision, and because every man aboard continued performing his duty until the very end. Today, nearly a century later, photographs of the shattered B-17 still circulate among historians and aviation enthusiasts around the world. At first glance, the image seems fake. The tail appears too damaged, the fuselage too broken, the survival too improbable. Yet every rivet, every torn panel, and every twisted beam tells the same incredible story. Some airplanes are remembered for the battles they fought, others for the bombs they carried. The All-American earned its place in history for something far simpler. It proved that sometimes, against every law of probability, a machine, and the people inside it, can simply refuse to fall